Hello and welcome to Rare Wine. Today we're going to talk about one of the most legendary winemakers in Burgundy. We're going to talk about a man named Henri Chayet, a man who changed things a lot, and also he didn't invent anything specific, but he just did a lot of things right, so he made some of the most amazing wines in Burgundy. Henri Chayet, he was born in 1922, so a long time ago, and he grew up in the little village of Vosne-Romanée. And when time came to the Second World War, he went to the university and he learned how to make wine there, and then he came back home. And in the middle of the war, he was a young man, he didn't go to war, so he started making wines and he helped some of the local people in Vosne-Romanée making their wines. And especially one family was very important, that was the Camusset family, where he started working with them on what is called a métayage, which is kind of a lease where he makes the wine and then they share the crop at the end. So he gets part of the production and the owner of the vineyard gets the other half of the production. And this métayage agreement with Camusset family is important also for what happened later on. Because in the early years, he worked with the Camusset family and they're part of some of the most important vineyards. They had a little bit of the SSO vineyard and the Richebourg and also some of the other Premier Cru vineyards in Vosne-Romanée. And they also owned a vineyard that was called Cru Parentout that wasn't really producing anything because it was a very complicated vineyard. It had too much stone, it didn't give enough yield, so nobody really took notice of this little vineyard, and it wasn't really planted with any good vines. So that was kind of abandoned. So he left it there for some years and then he worked on some of the other vineyards. But what made the legend of Henri Chayet was that he was he paid a lot of attention in the vineyard. He took care of each little vine, cutting them and tying them up in a very specific way. So he only took in the best grapes, and he was very strict, especially in his selection in the beginning. And normally at that time, the wine growers in Burgundy, they harvested everything they could. Whatever they could get in, they took in and made wines from that. But he was very strict in the selection, first in the vineyard, and then also when the grapes arrived at the winery. And that was something he did all the way up till his retirement in the early 2000s. But at the beginning, this strict selection was a new thing. And then he started something else that wasn't really done before. He started what we know today as a cold fermentation or cold soak, where you keep the must and you keep the grapes at a low temperature right after you get them into the winery. And this cold fermentation, that's where you get more color, and you also get more of the phenolics, and you get some of the taste and the flavors from the grapes drawn out from the grapes into the must. And he did that after he destemmed the grapes, and he always destemmed 100%. Nowadays we always talk about how many producers is using whole bunch fermentation or who's using stems in the fermentation to give that extra grip and that extra freshness to the must. But for Henri Chayet, he destemmed 100%. So he did this cold fermentation before the alcoholic fermentation, and that took out more flavors and more color to the wine. Then he did the normal fermentation, what we could call the alcoholic fermentation, and of course he only used the natural yeast. At that time it was not as normal to have cultured yeast to control the fermentation. So he used the natural yeast that was in the vineyard, so the yeast that is sitting on the outside of the grape, and then the natural yeast that was working in his cellar in Vosne-Romanée. So he did a very long fermentation because the cellar he had was relatively cold, and when the cellar is cold, the fermentation takes a little bit longer time to finish, but only with the natural yeast cells. So, and he never used too much oak. He used 1/3 new oak, or otherwise it was used oak. So he didn't get too much oak influence on the wine, only the natural slow oxidation process that you get from maturing the wine on the oak leaf, on the oak cask. So, but the funny thing also about Enragé is that his legend is built very much not on the production from the Richebourg or the SSO, which was the two Grand Cru vineyards he mainly worked on, but actually from a Premier Cru vineyard that we just mentioned earlier, the Cropang 2, and we just brought in a few bottles here. The Cropang 2 vineyard was owned by the Camusset family, and Enragé, he bought a little bit of it each year, so at the end he actually ended up owning a big part of the vineyard. And in some years his production was part owned by the Camusset, part owned by him. So and he got a little bit in return from the Camusset family. So the actual number of bottles each year has been very difficult to track down, but in basically it's around 1.01 hectare, the entire vineyard, and the entire production from this vineyard is around 4,000 bottles in a normal year. So, but what he did was actually in the beginning he almost used dynamite to blow away and loosen up the soil so he could plant vines. So he started working on planting vines in the Cropang 2 after the Second World War, and it was not until the 70s that he started to think that the vines were good enough to make his first Cropang 2. So 1978 was the first vintage from this specific vineyard, and the early years it was a good wine and people could see the potential. Nowadays I think we can easily say that Cropang 2 is reckoned as maybe the best Premier Cru vineyard in Burgundy. It's in a perfect position in Vosne-Romanée. What we have here is the 1996, which is a fantastic vintage, fantastic year. And these are very special bottles because these bottles come from the final sale of Enragé. So in 2018, a Swiss auction house held a big auction where they auctioned the last bottles from the original seller of Enragé. It was now bottles owned by his sister and his family, and they decided to sell out the rest of them, and they sold all of these in one auction in Switzerland, and it raised more than 30,000 Swiss francs at that time. So at that time it was the biggest private auction ever held. And all of the bottles came directly from the seller, new labels, that's why they look so good, and special boxes made only for this auction. So that's kind of the Enragé legend that was built around this Cropang 2 vineyard. Today, Enragé passed away in 2006, but in the last couple of years he took in his nephew, Emmanuel Rocher, and he kind of took over the winemaking process and took care of all the vineyards. And today he's taking care of the vineyards, and today he makes the Cropang 2 and it looks like this. But the part that was owned by the Camusset family is today made, of course, by Méo Camusset himself. So it actually also exists with this label. So that's kind of the two labels you have today from the Cropang 2 vineyard. And the style is, maybe you could say the Emmanuel Rocher is more specific in the style of Enragé, even though that Méo Camusset was also a good friend of Enragé and he worked alongside him in the cellar as well. But Emmanuel Rocher, you can say, is the natural heir, the new caretaker of the vineyards from Enragé. So that was a little bit of the history about Enragé. So thank you for joining us today. See you next time.